Ever get that feeling? Like a book's not just calling out to you, but kind of pulling you in. You know what I mean? Not with like crazy promises or anything, but with this genuine sense that it holds something, well, something you got to explore.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like a quiet invitation to an adventure.
That's exactly what we're doing today, diving deep into a book that fits that description perfectly.
I'm ready when you are. Let's go.
All right, buckle up. It's Adventurings in the Psychical by H. Addington Bruce. Published back in the early 1900s, but don't let that fool you. It's like this early 20th century deep dive into, well, what some folks might call supernatural territory.
Ghosts, telepathy, you name it. Bruce even tackles the idea of glimpsing into the future. But here's the catch.
Yeah.
He approaches all of it with a scientific mindset. A real quest to understand the mind's hidden potential.
And that's exactly what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We're looking at the strange cases Bruce meticulously collected and how folks back then tried to make sense of them.
Exactly. Forget the over-the-top Hollywood stuff. We're going for a more grounded approach, Seeing how these unexplained events were examined, using the scientific tools available back then.
No need for theatrics here.
You don't have to be a true believer to find this stuff fascinating.
Not at all. And who knows, maybe you'll even have one of those aha moments.
Exactly.
All right, so where do we even begin with a topic as vast and, let's face it, a little spooky as the psychical?
Well, ghosts seem like a good starting point. They're kind of universally intriguing and, let's be honest, often a bit unsettling.
You're telling me. It's fascinating, isn't it? That mix of skepticism and, let's be honest, fear.
It's like this weird push and pull.
We try to be rational. Dismiss the whole idea of ghosts as silly superstition.
But then you hear a strange noise late at night or, see something out of the corner of your eye.
And suddenly that firm skepticism starts to wobble a bit.
Happens to the best of us.
Bruce actually touches on this idea of people who say they don't believe but are still scared stiff.
It's funny. We can be all logical and dismissive during the day, but then nighttime rolls around.
Shadows get longer. The house creaks. And even the most logical mind might start conjuring up things.
Absolutely. The dark has a way of playing tricks on us.
What I find particularly compelling is that even back in Bruce's time, there was this shift. People were starting to move beyond mere superstition and hearsay when it came to ghosts.
There was a real desire to investigate these experiences in a more systematic, rigorous way. Groups like the English Society for Psychical Research really spearheaded this effort.
They were like, hey, wait a minute. Let's not just rely on spooky stories passed down through generations. Let's apply some scientific principles here.
They really wanted to understand the how and the why behind these ghostly encounters.
Exactly. And Bruce, being the meticulous researcher he was, provides some truly captivating examples of these well-documented ghost stories that were scrutinized under this new lens.
For instance, there's the case of Miss Goodrich Freer and her experience at Hampton Court Palace. Now, she deliberately chose to stay in a room known for being haunted.
Brave soul.
Right, but here's where it gets interesting. She made sure to lock and bolt the doors from the inside, just to be extra safe. And yet she still witnessed this glowing figure of a woman seemingly in prayer.
No way.
What makes this case so compelling is that there was absolutely no physical explanation for how the figure appeared or, for that matter, how it vanished.
I mean, could it have been some kind of elaborate hoax?
Maybe, but that locked room detail really throws a wrench into that theory.
Definitely adds another layer of intrigue.
Now, if that wasn't strange enough, we have the adventure of Miss Morrison and Miss Lamont at the Petit Trianon. Buckle up for this one, it's a real head-scratcher.
Oh, I'm ready for anything.
So they're walking around the grounds and they start encountering people. Nothing too unusual about that, right? Except these folks are dressed in what appears to be 18th century clothing.
Wait, what?
And it gets weirder. They see buildings that simply shouldn't be there.
Like buildings that don't exist in the present day.
Exactly. Later on, Miss Morrison actually identifies one of the figures they saw as Marie Antoinette from a portrait.
That's crazy.
What's truly remarkable is that their experience was so detailed. And later, when they investigated the actual layout of the grounds, it didn't match what they had seen.
So it's like they were somehow transported back in time.
It really makes you wonder, were they experiencing some kind of shared hallucination? Or was there something more to it, something that tapped into a historical echo, a snapshot of the past?
Makes you question what we truly understand about time and perception.
No kidding. Now, moving on to something perhaps a bit more, shall we say, traditional in the ghost story department.
Yeah, let's hear it.
We have the phenomenon of what Bruce calls death-announcing family ghosts.
Ooh, those are always creepy.
Right. These are basically legends or stories that are deeply ingrained in specific families, often passed down for generations.
The idea that certain families have their own personal harbingers of doom.
Exactly. Take, for example, the White Lady. She's said to appear before a death in the Hohenzollern lineage.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one. Super spooky.
Then you have the Arundel of Wardar family, who believe that white owls foretell a family member's demise. It makes you wonder about the psychology behind these persistent stories.
Right. What is it about family folklore and the anxieties surrounding mortality that give rise to these enduring tales?
Maybe it's a way of trying to make sense of the unpredictable nature of life and death, to find patterns where none truly exist. Or perhaps it's a way of coping with the fear of losing loved ones.
I suppose it could also be a way for families to feel connected to their history, even if it's through these rather morbid tales.
Absolutely. And speaking of morbid, we have to talk about the drummer of Corky Castle.
Oh, yeah, that one's a doozy. Gruesome, too.
The story goes that this poor drummer was, well, stuffed into his own drum and then tossed from the battlements.
Talk about a bad day at work.
Right. But the truly eerie part is that there are reports of ghostly drumming sounds preceding a death in the Ogilvy family. And it's not just family members who hear it. There are accounts from people unfamiliar with the legend, like Miss Dalrymple and an Englishman who encountered the drumming while out on the moor.
So, multiple witnesses, each with their own independent experience. That's what makes it so intriguing.
You can't just brush it off as a coincidence. It makes you think about the power of suggestion, or maybe even a shared cultural understanding somehow manifesting in these auditory experiences.
Fascinating, but definitely creepy.
And then there's the knocking ghost of the Basil Woods. This one's particularly striking because of the level of detail in the accounts. We're not talking about vague feelings of unease here. We're talking specific, distinct knocking sounds that were heard by multiple family members prior to the deaths of loved ones.
So it's not just any old knocking, it's a specific type of knocking.
Precisely. One account describes the sound as someone emptying a tobacco pipe, another as the hammering of nails. And what makes it even more compelling is that these sounds were heard by different people in different locations all around the same time, and all seemingly linked to these significant life transitions.
Wow, those are some pretty specific auditory experiences tied to very specific events. It's not just a general feeling of dread, it's like these sounds are directly connected to something bigger.
Exactly. It goes beyond vague premonitions.
You know, what I appreciate about Bruce is that he doesn't just present these spooky stories and leave us hanging.
Right. He actually delves into how people were attempting to explain these events scientifically. That's where things get really interesting, I think.
Definitely. It's a peek into how the scientific thinking of the time grappled with these genuinely baffling aspects of human experience.
So one of the prominent theories that was floating around back then was the idea of telepathic projection.
Telepathic projection, so like sending thoughts or images from one mind to another.
Pretty much. The idea is that a person who's dying might, either consciously or unconsciously, project an image or a feeling to someone who's alive and well.
Like a final message, or maybe a premonition of their passing.
In a way, yes. And there are cases that seem to support this idea, like when the narrator's grandfather appeared on the ceiling just before his death, or Mrs. Bettany's vision of her mother's heart attack, which happened at the exact same time.
It's like these powerful emotional or mental connections somehow bypass the limitations of physical distance.
Right. And Bruce also dives into the role of the percipient's own subconscious mind. He explores how latent memories or, things we've perceived but haven't consciously registered could play a part in these experiences.
So it's not necessarily something external, but rather something within our own minds that's shaping our perception.
Exactly. Like, for example, the case of Dr. Prince's patient who mistook a living relative for a ghost. Or remember that strange case at the Petit Trianon with those 18th century figures?
Oh yeah, the one with Marie Antoinette.
That one. Bruce suggests that maybe those ladies had some subconscious knowledge of the historical layout of the grounds, and that in a state of what he calls psychical dissociation, basically a temporary separation of mental functions, this latent knowledge kind of bubbled up to the surface and influenced their perception.
So their minds were playing tricks on them, but in a way that's rooted in real historical information.
It's like their subconscious minds were accessing a hidden archive of sorts.
That's wild.
And we can't forget the concept of waking dreams, these vivid experiences that seem to externalize our subconscious thoughts and ideas.
So it's like dreaming while you're awake.
Kind of. There's this case Bruce mentions of a Mr. Turner who saw a phantom chandelier that was an exact replica of one from his college chapel. It's like his mind conjured up this image based on a deeply buried memory.
Like a visual echo of the past.
And even auditory experiences, like Lady Erdley's hallucination, are presented as potentially originating from the subconscious mind.
So instead of attributing these things to external forces, like spirits or ghosts, Bruce is pointing towards the incredible complexity and, frankly, strangeness of our own minds.
Absolutely. He's shifting the focus from the supernatural to the inner workings of our own consciousness.
I like that. It's less about the spooky and more about the power of the human mind. And speaking of the mind, Bruce doesn't shy away from sharing some of his own personal experiences that led him to believe in the possibility of telepathy.
Ah, yes, his own adventurings in the psychical, so to speak.
Right. Now, these weren't controlled lab experiments or anything, more like personal coincidences that he found too remarkable to simply ignore.
But they were deeply impactful for him, nonetheless.
Oh, absolutely. Like that dream he had about his friend, Archie Tisdale, that occurred at the exact moment of his death.
Chilling, isn't it?
And then there was that time he distinctly heard his name called, seemingly out of nowhere, and felt this strange, overwhelming sense of connection to his future wife, who was experiencing a serious illness at that very moment.
Distance didn't seem to matter in that instance.
And he had a similar experience on the 4th of July, again hearing his name called, just before she tragically died from an accidental overdose.
It's like some unseen force was trying to alert him to bridge the gap between them.
And to add another layer to this, his wife's mother also had a vivid dream that mirrored the carriage accident his wife was involved in.
A series of interconnected events that defied rational explanation.
It's easy to dismiss these things as mere coincidences, but for Bruce, they were compelling evidence of a deeper connection between minds.
These personal anecdotes really highlight the kind of experiences that fueled early interest in telepathy and its potential to transcend the limitations of our physical senses.
But it's important to note that while Bruce and some prominent scientists of the time were convinced of telepathy's reality, the majority of the scientific community remained deeply skeptical.
Oh, absolutely. Many saw these claims as, well, unsubstantiated. They chalked it up to chance, faulty memory, or even deliberate deception.
You know, the classic explanations when something can't be easily explained.
Right. There was also a lot of focus on exploring the possibility of heightened but still natural sensory perception. The idea that our senses might be picking up on subtle cues that we're not consciously aware of.
Subliminal perception, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's a fascinating area of research, but for Bruce, it didn't fully account for the more remarkable instances of apparent telepathic communication.
So what did he present as more concrete evidence?
Well, he dives into some intriguing experiments that were conducted during that time. One example he highlights is Professor Hislop's work with a mind reader. Hislop felt that the level of accuracy achieved in these experiments couldn't be explained away by subconscious cues alone.
Like the mind reader was consistently getting things right, even when there seemed to be no logical way for them to know the information.
Precisely. Then there's the fascinating case of Madame Clarence de Vouroyer. She seemingly influenced her friend's dream all the way in the United States.
Transatlantic dream manipulation. That's next level stuff.
I know, right? The dream included specific imagery like gold circles and the names of his deceased relatives. It's like she was sending targeted mental messages across a vast distance.
Wow.
Bruce also delves into experiments that were specifically focused on creating telepathic phantasms, like visual apparitions.
So attempting to project one's image into the mind of another person.
That's the idea. There's a story about a Harvard professor who tried to mentally project his image to a friend. And then there's Reverend Stanton Moses, who claimed to have successfully appeared visually to a recipient known as Z.
Like a ghostly projection, but intentionally created through the power of the mind.
Precisely. While the results of these experiments were often inconsistent and difficult to replicate under controlled conditions, they nevertheless fueled the belief that mental images could potentially be transmitted from one mind to another.
And then you have the Burt Usher experiments with drawing transfer. These offer a particularly insightful look at how telepathy might actually work, or at least how complex it could be.
Yes, these experiments were quite revealing. What they found was that the image received by the participant wasn't always an exact replica of the original drawing. It was often influenced by subconscious associations and emotional connections between the sender and the receiver.
So it's not like sending a fax. It's more like sending a feeling or an impression that's then interpreted by the recipient's own mind.
And the Miles and Ramsden experiments further investigated these subtle influences, suggesting that if telepathy exists, it might not be as straightforward as we might imagine.
It's less about clear-cut mental transmissions and more about a nuanced interplay of subconscious factors and emotional resonance.
Exactly. Bruce ultimately concludes that genuine thought transference likely relies more on these underlying subconscious feelings and the intensity of emotions involved, rather than conscious effort or willpower.
So it's not about trying really hard to send a thought, it's about the emotional charge behind it.
He also points out that a common way these telepathic messages seem to manifest is through auditory hallucinations.
So hearing things that aren't actually there.
Precisely. And Bruce himself had those experiences, remember? Hearing his name called at significant moments. He also mentions a chilling account of an Englishman who heard a horrifying shriek at the exact moment his tenant committed suicide.
Wow.
It's like these intense moments of emotional upheaval, these crises, somehow create a ripple effect in the psychic realm.
Makes you wonder if there's some kind of subconscious safety net at play, trying to warn us or prepare us for difficult events.
Maybe. And Bruce also points out cases where these telepathic impulses seem to trigger actions that actually prevented potential disasters.
Like some kind of psychic intuition guiding people towards safety.
Exactly. He mentions William Blakeway, who suddenly felt this overwhelming urge to return home, even though he had no logical reason to do so. When he got there, he found his child in danger from a fire.
It's like his subconscious mind somehow picked up on the danger and compelled him to act.
It's as if there's this interconnectedness beneath the surface, bypassing our normal sensory and cognitive processes.
Absolutely fascinating. And before we move on, we have to touch on Bruce's exploration of telepathic dreams.
Ah, yes, the symbolic language of the subconscious mind.
He delves into how these dream experiences can often be filled with symbolism, and how those symbols might hold hidden messages or insights.
He uses the example of a lady who had a dream about a Mr. V and her daughter, which, upon closer examination, revealed a deeper meaning related to their real-life interactions and dynamics.
It's like our dreams are trying to communicate with us in this coded language.
Maybe they are. Perhaps it's a way for our subconscious minds to process information and emotions that we haven't fully dealt with consciously.
That makes sense. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about clairvoyance.
The ability to see things that are distant in space or time, to perceive events beyond the reach of our normal senses.
Sounds pretty far out there.
It does, doesn't it? But Bruce actually presents a number of spontaneous cases that really make you question what's possible.
Like what?
Well, there's Mrs. Titus, who had remarkably accurate visions of the location where a drowning occurred.
Like she saw it happening in her mind.
That's the idea. And then there's Mrs. Alfred Wedgwood, whose dream about her father-in-law's accident matched the details of the actual event perfectly.
So it's not just vague premonitions, but specific details about events that haven't happened yet.
Precisely. And then we have Dr. Young, whose dream of an attack was later corroborated by the details given by the suspects who were arrested.
So his dream was like a precognitive crime report.
It's pretty wild, right?
And it doesn't stop there. There's Mrs. Hilda West, whose dream about her father nearly having an accident in Norway aligned with a real event that occurred shortly after.
And we can't forget Dr. Galinsky, whose dream about a patient experiencing a hemorrhage mirrored the actual situation he encountered upon arriving at the hospital.
Wow. These are some pretty convincing examples of seeing things beyond the realm of normal perception.
It's hard to explain away.
It is. But what's interesting is that even while presenting these seemingly clear-cut cases of clairvoyance, Bruce also explores the possibility that many of these experiences could potentially be explained through a combination of telepathy and a heightened sensitivity of the subconscious mind.
So it's not necessarily about seeing the future directly, but about unconsciously tapping into information from other minds.
Like a psychic network of sorts.
Kind of. Or maybe it's about the subconscious mind being able to process subtle environmental cues or patterns that we're not consciously aware of.
Our brains are picking up on things that we don't even realize.
Exactly. Bruce mentions an experiment conducted by Mr. G.A. Smith using hypnosis. A hypnotized subject was able to accurately describe a friend's office down to specific details and even perceived a mentally projected umbrella.
So like a telepathic connection facilitated by an altered state of consciousness.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Clairvoyants often failed to consistently demonstrate their abilities in tests designed to eliminate telepathy and subconscious cues as possible explanations.
Like those tests where they try to identify a number on a sealed banknote or something.
Precisely. When those variables were controlled for, the results were often inconclusive.
So it raises questions about the reliability and consistency of these claimed clairvoyant abilities.
It does. But Bruce also acknowledges that subconscious perception can play a powerful role in shaping our experiences, sometimes leading to what seems like clairvoyance.
So it's like our minds are constantly processing information, piecing things together below the level of conscious awareness.
And sometimes those subconscious insights can surface in surprising ways.
He mentions a case where a lady had a dream about a lost cuff stud and then actually found it later.
Exactly. Her mind might have subconsciously registered where the cuff stud was, and then that information surfaced in her dream.
It's like those moments when you suddenly remember where you left your keys.
Exactly.
So it's not necessarily psychic, but rather the power of the subconscious mind at work.
Right. Now, on a related note, we have to talk about crystal gazing.
Ah, yes, the classic image of the fortune teller peering into her crystal ball.
It was widely believed back then that crystal gazing could induce clairvoyant visions.
Like the crystal acts as a portal to hidden knowledge or something.
Some people believed that. Bruce shares examples of visions reported by crystal gazers, but he's careful to point out that many of these visions could potentially be explained by subconscious processes.
So it's not the crystal itself that's magical, but rather the way it's used as a focal point for the mind.
Exactly. He mentions Miss Angus, whose crystal visions often seem to be connected to her own thoughts or information she had encountered earlier.
Like the crystal was reflecting her own subconscious mind back at her.
Precisely. And then there's Miss X, whose visions included addresses and scenes that could often be traced back to subconscious perceptions she had during conversations or walks.
Like her mind was gathering these little bits of information and then weaving them into these seemingly clairvoyant experiences.
And we can't forget Miss Goodrich Freer's experience with the number 7694 appearing in her crystal. That turned out to be her bank book number.
Wow, what are the odds?
But Bruce astutely points out that there's always the possibility of her having subconsciously glimpsed that number before or during the crystal gazing session.
So it's not necessarily proof of clairvoyance, but rather a fascinating interplay of perception, memory, and the subconscious mind.
Ultimately, Bruce concludes that while some crystal visions might involve telepathic elements, a significant number can likely be attributed to the surfacing of latent memories, subconscious associations, and the power of suggestion.
It's like the crystal acts as a catalyst, bringing these hidden thoughts and impressions to the surface.
And it's fascinating how the mind can create these elaborate and seemingly paranormal experiences from the raw material of our own experiences and perceptions.
Definitely makes you think twice about what we perceive as reality. Now, let's move on to another fascinating and often misunderstood phenomenon, automatic speaking and writing.
Ah, yes, the realm of mediums and channeling.
This stuff has always been shrouded in mystery and, frankly, a bit of controversy.
Because it often gets tied up with the belief in communication with spirits or discarnate entities, right?
Exactly. So, what kind of cases does Bruce present?
Well, there's the story of the medium at a seance attended by a friend of Henry Ward Beecher. This medium seemed to know specific details about the friend's recent visit to Beecher's grave.
Like information that the medium couldn't have possibly known through normal means?
Right. And then we have the spirit messages conveyed through coreless-type mediums. These were individuals who claimed to be able to channel messages from the deceased.
So they're acting as a conduit for communication from the other side.
That's the claim. There are messages purportedly from the spirits of Wagner and Liszt for a young woman, and a message for a woman in mourning, supposedly from someone named Frederick.
So specific names, specific messages.
And Bruce also shares the story of his own artist friend who received a message during a seance regarding a job offer in California. The message was attributed to a deceased general.
Wow, that's pretty specific.
Right. And finally, there's the case of Miss Edith Wright, a medium who claimed to be controlled by the spirit of Amelia B. Morton.
So a full-on possession scenario.
That's how it was presented. But as with everything else we've discussed, Bruce offers alternative explanations for these phenomena, explanations grounded in the known capabilities of the living mind.
No spirits necessary.
Not necessarily. Telepathy between the medium and the sitter is one of the key hypotheses he explores.
So the medium might be unconsciously picking up on the thoughts, memories, or even desires of the people present at the seance.
Exactly. Like in the cases of Beecher's friend and the artist's friend, the medium might have been tapping into their conscious or subconscious minds without even realizing it.
And that could explain how these seemingly impossible pieces of information are revealed.
Right. He also explores the possibility of latent telepathic messages. This is the idea that information might be received telepathically at an earlier time, but doesn't surface until later, perhaps during the automatic communication.
So it's like the message is stored in the subconscious mind and then retrieved later on.
Exactly. The case of Miss Wright and Mr. Brown provides an interesting example. A message received during a sitting seemed to relate to a future event involving Mr. Brown.
So it's like a delayed telepathic message, a precognitive message of sorts.
It's certainly a possibility. And then we have the case of Mrs. Leonora E. Piper, who provided specific details about Sir Oliver Lodge's uncle's watch.
That one sounds familiar.
It's a famous case. And Bruce explores a range of possible explanations, from childhood overhearing to telepathy, from living relatives who knew the details.
So it's like a puzzle with multiple potential solutions.
And then there's the idea of telepathy à trois, telepathic communication involving more than two individuals. This could potentially explain some of the more intricate and seemingly collaborative messages that emerge during seances.
It's like a telepathic conference call.
Kind of.
Yeah.
It suggests that there might be this complex web of unconscious mental connections among those present.
Like we're all tapping into a collective pool of information without even realizing it.
It's a mind-boggling concept.
It is.
And we can't overlook the role of the automatist's own subconscious mind. The person doing the automatic speaking or writing might be in a trance state, much like hypnosis, which we know can increase suggestibility.
So they're more susceptible to outside influences.
Exactly. The sitters themselves, even unintentionally, might be influencing the content of the automatic communication through their expectations, their beliefs, their subconscious cues.
It's like a feedback loop, with everyone's minds contributing to the experience.
Bruce mentions the fascinating case of Charles H. Tout, who consciously impersonated spirits based on suggestions he received during seances. It really highlights the power of suggestion and how easily our minds can be influenced, especially in those altered states of consciousness.
That's wild. And finally, Bruce touches upon the complex phenomenon of cross-correspondence.
Ah, yes, the interconnected web of messages across multiple mediums.
This is where things get really intricate. You have these fragmented messages, often seemingly unrelated, but then, when pieced together, they reveal a single, coherent theme.
It was often seen as evidence of a coordinated effort by discarnate spirits communicating through these different channels.
Like they're orchestrating this elaborate message from beyond the veil.
That was the interpretation. But Bruce, ever the skeptic, argues that even this complex pattern could potentially be explained by elaborate telepathic interactions between living minds.
So instead of spirits communicating, it's the minds of the mediums and the sitters, unconsciously influencing each other and creating this tapestry of interconnected messages.
It's a mind-boggling theory, but it highlights the incredible potential of the human mind to create these seemingly paranormal experiences.
And how much we still don't understand about the hidden depths of our own consciousness. Now let's wrap up this deep dive with a look at poltergeists.
Those noisy and mischievous entities that seem to delight in causing chaos and disruption.
The classic image of objects flying around a room, furniture moving on its own, unexplained noises.
Bruce presents the intriguing case of Mrs. B and the strange occurrences within her house.
Tell me more.
It all started with messages received through a planchette board, a device often used in seances to communicate with spirits. The messages attributed the strange happenings to mischievous spirits.
So they were getting messages directly from the alleged poltergeists.
That was the claim. And the phenomena were pretty classic poltergeist fare. Stones being thrown, bouquets of flowers appearing on a tree, even the discovery of some skeletons.
Sounds like a scene straight out of a horror movie.
Right. But here's the twist. Bruce reveals that a young boy in the household, E.D., confessed to causing at least some of these events.
So a case of a mischievous child creating a spooky atmosphere for attention or, well, just for kicks.
Exactly. And Bruce goes on to say that a significant number of poltergeist cases investigated by the Society for Psychical Research were likely byproducts of what was then termed hysteria.
Now, it's important to note that hysteria, back then, was a much broader diagnostic category than it is today. It encompassed a range of psychological and even physical symptoms, that were believed to stem from the mind.
Exactly. It wasn't just about emotional outbursts. It could manifest as unusual behaviors, even a degree of unintentional deception or attention seeking.
So, in the case of poltergeists, these individuals might not have been consciously faking it. Their subconscious minds might have been driving these actions, creating these seemingly paranormal events as a way of expressing some underlying psychological distress.
It's a fascinating concept, and it really underscores the central theme that runs throughout Bruce's book, the powerful and often underestimated role of the subconscious mind.
He argues that many of the psychical phenomena we've been discussing can be better understood by looking inward, by exploring the hidden depths of our own mental processes.
Absolutely. He emphasizes the concept of dissociated mental states, these fragmented aspects of our consciousness that can operate independently of our conscious awareness.
Like those split personality cases we hear about.
And Bruce argues that these dissociated states can significantly impact our physical and mental well-being.
So our minds can literally make us sick.
In a way, yes. He uses the example of hysteria and its diverse and often seemingly unrelated symptoms. The case of Justine, who had a debilitating fear of cholera, is presented as a psychical malady rooted in the subconscious.
So her irrational fear was manifesting as real physical symptoms.
Exactly. It highlights the powerful connection between mind and body.
Makes you wonder how much of what we experience as physical illness might actually have its roots in our minds.
And then there's the case of Marcelle and her chronic anxiety. Bruce argues that these dissociated ideas, these repressed thoughts or memories that we're no longer consciously aware of, can still exert a powerful influence on our conscious experience, leading to feelings of unease, distress, even physical discomfort without a clear, identifiable cause.
So it's like these unresolved emotional issues are lurking beneath the surface, creating all sorts of havoc in our lives.
And Bruce points out that there were emerging psychotherapeutic methods that were showing promise in treating these conditions by addressing these dissociated mental states.
So bringing these repressed experiences back into conscious awareness through talk therapy, hypnosis, that kind of thing.
Exactly. And by doing so, mitigating their negative impact on the individual's overall well-being.
It's all about restoring balance and harmony within the mind.
To really drive home the power and complexity of dissociation,